Welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today we'll be heading over to the American Athletic Conference and taking a look at the Green Wave of Tulane, who finished 9-5 last season and capped off their season with an appearance in the Gasparilla Bowl. They wrapped up their 2025 spring practice with their spring game on April 19th. We have a special guest joining us today. He is the beat reporter for the Times-Picayune, New Orleans Advocate. He is a publisher of thewavereport.com for rivals. He is Gary Smith. Gary can be found at GUER Smith on X. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Thanks for having me on the show. Always enjoy doing this.
We're glad to have you back. And for people who are just tuning into the G5 Hive for the first time, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been covering Tulane football?
Sure. I'm a New Orleans-born kid to actually two Tulane graduates. My parents, but I ended up going to the University of Florida, lived there all the way up from graduation until 2008, covering the Gators, moved back to New Orleans to get married to a New Orleans woman, started covering Tulane midway through the 2010 season. That's when I took over the Rivals site. And then about 2 years later, I started working for what was then the New Orleans Advocate and now is the Times-Picayune-NOLA.com. So basically, I've been covering this team full time since October of 2010.
For those not familiar with Tulane's offensive style, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's kind of it's one of those fit the personnel type of offense. Their offensive coordinator, Joe Craddock, who when he was at SMU earlier in his career was the youngest offensive coordinator in the country. Back then they were a little more pass happy, a little more no huddle type offense. He's more reflecting John Sumrall's philosophy, and it's a run first offense. And it's a find your best back and give it to them a whole heck of a lot type of offense. That was true at Troy and last year at Tulane. We'll see if they can continue that this year. It may not be as clear cut, but definitely it's not real conservative either. They last year when Darian Mensah came out of nowhere to become a great quarterback, they used a lot of play action and a lot of long developing plays because Mensah was really good at going to his second and third reads and holding onto the ball and finding the right receiver. I think they're going to change the offense a little bit this year. I think they want to throw the backs more. They don't have Darian Mensah anymore. It's going to be a lot more quick hitting passes because when they looked at their offense, they thought that was one of the weaknesses last year, that they sometimes didn't have any enough quick hitting pass plays, which made it really different from your modern college football offense. And they really concentrated in the spring, throwing a lot more to the backs and a lot more quick reads where they're not relying on the quarterback to have to go through a ton of reads before he makes the throw.
Well, Gary, let's move over to the position where it all starts on offense, and that's the quarterback. Last offseason, all the talk was, is it Kai Horton? Is it Ty Thompson? But another guy in this room emerged this offseason. You mentioned him, Darian Mensah. Mensah's now off to Duke. Yeah. Horton is off to Washington. Thompson's converting to a tight end. Tulane will spend their offseason again looking for their QB in 2025. Caden Simonza transfers in from Ball State. Mm-hmm. Devin Leary comes to Tulane via Illinois. While not yet on campus, Braden Sullivan also transfers in from Iowa. I should also mention TJ Finley transferred in too, but has since gone back into the portal. Mm-hmm. There's a lot going on in this room. What should I make of the quarterback situation heading into 2025?
Well, the good news is they're ahead of where they were at the end of last spring when they had no idea who their quarterback was going to be. The bad news is I've never seen a quarterback improve more than Darian Mensah did from the end of spring to last season. Because I'm sure when I was on the pod this thing last year, I didn't mention him as a serious candidate. I just didn't think these coaches would go with a guy who had no experience. I also didn't realize how the other guys they looked better in the spring than they did in the fall. His competition, and he was great in the fall, and it actually ended up being an easy decision, even though it seemed really hard at the time because he was so much better than the other quarterbacks in fall scrimmages. But this year, I didn't see a starting quarterback in the spring. I think TJ Finley was the front runner. He's had experience. I have serious question marks about this guy because clearly he's a good practice player because everywhere he's been, LSU, Auburn, Texas State, Western Kentucky, he won the starting quarterback job at some point. And at the first two schools, he lost it. And at the third school, he had a record-setting season for the school, and they liked him so much they brought in a transfer from Arizona in January who had sexual assault hanging over him in the past and forced him to leave. So I didn't trust him anyway, but he did seem to be the front runner for the first half of spring. Caden Samanza and Donovan Leary did not look great. Particularly, they had a scrimmage a couple of days after TJ got suspended, and they were really terrible. Then they were really pretty darn good in the next 4 or 5 practices leading into the spring game. And in the spring game, they were really terrible. One, the offensive line couldn't protect because their defensive line is loaded this year, but I didn't get a good yet. Caden Samanza is he's got a lot of moxie. He's 5'11". He can make plays on the run, passing plays. He's kind of a gamer type, but he did get sacked a ton for a very bad Ball State team. And Donovan Leary has a better arm, but he just didn't play much at Illinois. So it's really hard to get a read on how he's going to play in a game. So honestly, having never seen Brendan Sullivan, knowing that he was at Iowa, which is known for one thing on offense, which is terrible offense in the last several years, I would say he would be the slight front runner going into the fall. That's why they knew they had to go in and get another quarterback. One, because not just because they knew TJ Finley wasn't going to be back, but because they're not confident that they had the starting quarterback on the roster. He apparently, I don't know a whole lot about him. I know he's a better athlete than either Caden Samanza or Donovan Leary. He can make a little more plays with his feet. Other than that, it's as wide open going into the fall this year as it was last year. And last year, the guy I said was the clear-cut number 3 ended up being the clear-cut number 1. So I'm a little hesitant to pull the trigger this time.
Understandably so.
Yeah.
Moving on to the running game, last year you felt great about this room with Mekhi Hughes leading the charge. However, the first team all-conference player is now off to Oregon. Shady Clayton Johnson is off to North Texas, and Trey Cornish has gone over to Central Michigan. That leaves 319 rushing attempts, 1,777 rushing yards, and 17 touchdowns up for grabs here in 2025.
Yeah.
This room returns Arnold Barnes III and Jamori McClure as guys who saw snaps in 2024. They also added Zuberi Mobley and Maurice Turner from the portal. How did the running backs look this spring?
I actually think, obviously, we don't know who's going to be the lead back, and Mekhi Hughes is a terrific player. I liked what I saw. I think the running backs are still going to be the strength of the team. That's the history under this at Tulane and this coaching staff. They know what to do with their running backs. And I honestly like all 4 of those running backs in the spring. I'm pretty sure that Maurice Turner is going to start the year as their number 1 back, but it's going to totally depend on how they play after that because he does all the things right off the field in practice. He shows up. He's a great practice player. He's really shifty. I feel like John Summerall loved the way he could put his foot in the ground and totally reverse direction on plays in the spring. I kind of felt like he may have done that a little bit too much at times. My guy in the backfield is Jamori McClure. Tulane's had a lot of great running backs since I started covering them. Other than Tyjae Spears, who was off the charts good, Jamori McClure in scrimmages and practices has looked the best of anyone to me. But the first 2 weeks, John Summerall never mentioned him. And then I found out why. Jamori McClure did not play high school football until his junior year in Alabama. And he's very raw. And they don't, all that stuff that people don't talk about that coaches care about a lot, like blitz protection, knowing who to block, knowing where to go, and just being as focused every day is where Jamori McClure needs to improve. But he'll get a chance early in the year. But when the ball's in his hands and he knows where he's going, he's a tough, physical, fast runner with good moves. And Arnold Barnes is the most experienced running back returning. He was kind of last year. He was kind of Mekhi Hughes Jr. They were kind of the same type running back. They were both physical, tough running backs. It'll help him that he's not competing against a guy who's like him now. He has a chance to be the starter. And Zuberi Mobley came on in the last couple of weeks of spring. He's a really good receiver out of the backfield. He did some good stuff. I think they're going to play all those guys. They don't have a soft schedule this year. There are no cupcakes on it, but they're going to play all those guys early. And one of them, I think, is going to become the bellwether back because that's just the history of how John Summerall operates his offenses.
Let's move over to the wide receiver room. We saw their top 3 receivers graduate in Mario Williams, Keith Brown, and Dante Fleming. That trio accounted for 192 targets, 2,094 yards, and 11 touchdowns. What does 2025 look like?
I'm not sure. That to me, that's the big, along with quarterback, that's an equivalent concern. And that may have been a factor in why the quarterbacks struggled at times this spring. Because like you mentioned, first of all, I didn't know what to expect from Mario Williams last year coming from USC. I thought he'd have a big head. He had not had a very good year at USC the year before. Had dropped a lot of passes. Aside from he still had some hands problems at times. He was terrific on and off the field last year. And by the end of the year, he was sensational. Ended up with over 1,000 yards. They don't have a Mario Williams on this roster. So I'm really not sure how that's gonna develop. The best talented returning receiver that they have is Shaz Preston, who was good enough to get recruited by Alabama out of high school, out of the woods. So that says something. But he didn't catch a pass in 2 years at Alabama. And Summerall's talked about how when he arrived at Tulane last year, he had no confidence. And then right before the season, right before fall practice started, he had a bad hamstring injury last year that kind of forced him out for the first half of the year. He made a few plays in the second half of the year. He looked good in the spring, but again, you don't really know what you have in him until the games. And then the guy they thought was going to be their marquee receiver in the transfer portal was Omari Hayes, the FAU transfer. He got hurt on the first day of spring and never practiced again. It wasn't an injury that's going to affect him for the fall, but they don't know what they're getting. They also think he's going to be a terrific punt returner. He was the guy they thought was the closest they had to a Mario Williams type, and they don't know yet because of him. And then Bryce Bohannon, whose 10 catches were the most of any returning receiver. He's a fifth-year guy who has never been able to really get separation, but it really does look like he's one of those guys. He's always been a great leader, great behind the scenes. He looked a lot faster in the spring. He really does look like a different player now. But again, you don't really know what's going to happen until the game started. Then they brought in none of the other all the other receivers on the roster. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they weren't. They've definitely got some concerns at that position. I know they brought in Trey Shackelford from Washington State, who didn't do much at Washington State last year, but did really well at his previous school. He'll be right in the mix. But that's another position like quarterback that preseason practice is really going to determine the depth chart. Starters at the beginning of the year, though, I think if Omari Hayes is healthy, it'll be him, Shaz Preston, and Bryce Bohannon, and then how they play will determine what the depth chart looks down the road.
So, who do you think's, if you had to take your best guess? I know you said it's kind of up in the air, but as I mentioned earlier, there's 192 targets that are vacant from 2020 or from 2024. Who do you think is going to step up and be that lead wide receiver for this offense in 2025? I'm
not 100% confident on it, but I think Shaz Preston has the physical skills. He's big and really fast, and he's got some moves too. They had a scrimmage where twice he caught a little out pass, and then the cornerback came up and he just spun around and shook him and went right down the field for a big game. I'd say he's the best bet of those guys. I'd love to. Maybe it'll be Omari Hayes. I mean, the coaches absolutely love him. I just didn't get to see the guy because he got hurt, like I said, right in the first week of spring practice.
If you were to describe how tight ends are utilized in this offense to someone that's never caught a Tulane game, how would you describe it?
Well, Joe Craddock was a tight ends coach for 2 years at UAB after it didn't go too well for the whole staff at Arkansas when he was offensive coordinator there. So he likes his tight ends. And guys, he made the single most surprising comment I've ever had a coach give to me in an interview during spring. Near the end of the spring, he came in to talk, and I asked him about the tight ends, and he said he thinks his tight end room has the potential to be the best in the American Athletic Conference and one of the absolute best in the country. I had a hard time not just reacting because I was stunned actually by that answer with what they have. I didn't. It's not that I didn't see it in the spring. It's just they don't have anybody with many catches in the past. Obviously, Bauman transferred to Miami after the year, and the revelation position in the first 2 weeks of spring was Ty Thompson, who had one who had his audition to transfer to another school at quarterback in their bowl game against Florida last year and bombed it. And so nobody was going to take him at quarterback. So he stayed at Tulane. They moved him to tight end. He really, really looked good in those first 2 weeks of spring. Then he suffered a freak knee injury that's not even usually a football type injury in practice. And it's unclear what his status is going to be. John Summerall says he's a really good athlete. Athletes recover quicker than the normal human. He expects him to be back by the beginning of preseason practice, but it's not a sure thing. Other than that, I mean, Anthony Miller was the best guy on the roster in the spring. The other guys, they didn't do a whole lot. That was about the most surprising statement I've heard from a coach. But Joe Craddock, he likes to throw the tight ends, and he's not a guy that just blows smoke and says crazy things normally. So he's pretty impressed with this group. So we'll see how it comes out. I think getting Ty Thompson back, if he's healthy, would make a difference, because it's funny. He's been a quarterback his whole life, and he looked like a natural from day one when he was playing tight end.
Well, you mentioned Alex Bowman being gone. He led the team in touchdown receptions with 7 a year ago. Obviously, he's gone over to the U. But if you had to guess, if there was a guy in that room that you thought maybe could kind of duplicate his season, would that be Ty Thompson or Miller, or maybe a combination?
It'd be one of those two, a combination. I don't think anybody's going to catch 7 touchdown passes at that position. But as a group, they could equal that. I think it'll be those two guys in some combination, if Ty Thompson truly is healthy by the beginning of the year. And again, he looked good at times at quarterback in practice last year, and then when the game started, he was great as a Wildcat quarterback, but when he had to make throws, he looked like a deer in the headlights. You don't really know how he'd play at a totally brand new position that he's never played before. But again, the coach, they were raving about him after the first week of spring drills, and he was the best player on offense in the first week of spring drills.
All right, so Gary, the offensive line graduates its entire right side and center, along with key reserve Caleb Thomas. But Tulane's a little bit different than most teams when taking the loss to their offensive line. They returned 2 first-team all-conference players in left tackle Derek Graham and left guard Shadre Hurst. Plus, they returned several players who saw a handful of snaps in 2024, and then they added 5 transfers to bolster this room. Yeah. What are the expectations for this room heading into 2025?
Yeah, they're very solid, as you said, on the left side of the offensive line. It was hard to judge the right side of the offensive line because the defensive line was so good in spring. They really, not every practice, but a lot of practices, they controlled affairs, and I didn't get a real read on who the best guys were. It was weird. Like, one of their transfers was Jude McCoskey. He left to go to Purdue, I believe, in the portal, and he was never working with the first team at Tulane in the spring. He was working second team, so that I was surprised that Purdue was interested in him, and maybe that says something about the depth that they have on the offensive line. They did get a big transfer. I think Jack Hollifield is going to be a starter, I'm pretty sure. That's why they brought him in after spring, because they knew I don't think they were really confident with what they had on the right side of the offensive line. I'm really not sure about the other spots. They rotated guys in and out, and I didn't get a real clear read on who's really going to step up at center or any of those positions. And I think that's why they needed to get a guy in like Jack Hollifield, who's already been a confirmed full-time starter in college.
So Tulane's known for running the ball, so let's run to the left, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that'll be the plan at the beginning of the year. Yes, and again, they liked other guys. John Bach, the coach, is like he had maybe, and I'm probably too influenced by the spring game where the offensive line where first of all, Derek Graham and Shadre Hurst were pulled after 5 plays, and so it was they were a sieve that day in terms of in line. But the coaches like John Bach, they have some of their returning guys they like. They like Reese Baker, who played for him last year. I just didn't get a real good read on how that depth chart's going to shape up by the beginning of the year.
All right, if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who would that be?
Yeah, I'm going to stick to my gut and go with Jamari McClure. Just in the belief that he will get all of the stuff you need to learn down. Again, I think Maurice Turner is going to be their starter at the beginning of the year. But Jamari McClure, when he has the ball in his hand, good things happen. he really played a lot in only one game last year against UAB. Now, Tulane scored 100,000 points in that game, and UAB quit in the second half. But he had a great game that day. The same time, it looked like the practices I'd seen before the season started. I think he had like 80 yards. He had one really big run. So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that he'll figure it out. And he's dangerous with the ball in his hand. And these coaches, and if he proves he's good, he'll get the ball a lot because he's a physical, durable guy.
For those not familiar with Tulane's defensive scheme, how would you describe it?
It's your base. I mean, it's a 3-4, pretty fairly aggressive. Nothing crazy in that. They rely on their defensive line to get most of the pressure. They were better statistically. Tulane was better in coverage last year than they were against the run. But John Summerall can't stand giving up big plays. And last year they gave up a lot of big runs. I had like 5 runs that just broke wide open. And I think that's been their number one priority in the offseason to fix that. But it's your basic look, not a lot of blitzing, dropping 7 in coverage a lot, relying on their front 4 to get pressure, and relying on the linebackers and cornerbacks to be good tacklers too, because they play a pretty significant role in the run defense.
Well, let's move over to the position groups in this defense and start up front with the defensive line. By the way of graduation or the portal, this group sees 6 of their top 7 linemen in terms of snaps depart from this room, one of which was first-team all-conference Patrick Jenkins, who was tied for second most in sacks with 4 and generated the second most pressures with 26. Looking at this 2025 team, the D-line is highlighted by the return of Cameron Hamilton, who had 4 sacks and 18 pressures just a season ago. How did that unit look and come together this spring?
They lost a lot of guys and a lot of numbers, and this was easy to see. It was the best unit on the team in the spring. I mean, they did an unbelievable job in the transfer portal. Now, again, you got to see how do they mesh once games start, because they haven't played together a lot. But I'm going to give you one name. There were a lot of guys that flashed, but I'll give you one name in particular, Santana Hopper, who came in from Appalachian State. He's a beast. In fact, we were interviewing Dixon Agu, their med school student linebacker, one day, and I asked him about the defensive line. He said Santana Hopper has the best. He sheds tackles better, sheds blocks better than any defensive lineman that he's played with at Tulane in his 3 years, and pursues the ball. He's a wrecker up front, and that makes all the difference in the world. But and then Cam Hamilton, he had always been a defensive tackle at Tulane. Early last year, they moved him outside, and that turned out to be his natural spot. I think he's going to have a huge year too. He's legally deaf. And they've had to make adjustments along the way. He was a Willie Fritz recruit, and so it took him maybe a little longer to develop and become comfortable. But I think he can have an all AAC caliber year too. And then pick a name from these other guys. I mean, they brought in Ty Cooper from Mississippi State. He thought he was going to start. He ended up second team and transferred right back out at the end of the portal because I don't think he was going to get much playing time. Adonis Freelo, who looked like he was headed for an all-star career at Tulane and then had a serious knee injury a week before the season, the year they went to the Cotton Bowl. He's now a 5th-year senior. He transferred. I think he ended up at Baylor, but he barely had 10 tackles he's never seemed to – he gained weight when he was out, and he's never seemed to become the same player. But these are good. These are guys that were going to be rotation players that transferred out at the end during spring or the end of spring because they didn't think they were going to get enough playing time with all these new guys. It really looks like they hit on almost everyone that they got out of the transfer portal, and it's going to be the strength of the team.
That would be a huge, because getting those names right out of the transfer portal, it's like hit or miss.
Yeah, totally.
And yeah, if you can hit on all of them, that would be great. Let's take a look at the linebacking group, and it looks solid heading into 2025. You got several guys returning this season. However, Tyler Grubbs graduated, and that's a big loss. He accounted for the most tackles on the team with 59. He was also on the field like all the time for this defense. Yeah. How did this linebacker group look into the spring, and did anyone stand out to you?
They were solid, and look, Tyler Grubbs is an excellent player. There's no doubt about that. they're going to be more athletic this year because Tyler Grubbs and Sam Howard, their two starting linebackers, were like the same guy last year. Not the most athletic in the world, but very heady, knew where to be, great instincts. This year, Sam Howard is going to be back. And what a story he is, a former walk-on at Austin Peay who became one of Tulane's best players last year. And the second he arrived on campus after spring, he became a team leader and ended up being named a co-captain. So they have him back, but they've got two really good athletes. They only play two inside linebackers at a time. Dixon Agu, the one I mentioned, he's a med school student. How you can do both, how you can do that and play football at the same time in a school like Tulane, I don't know, but he's managed to do it. He had a pretty solid year as a backup last year. I think he's going to probably be a start at the beginning of the year. But a guy who had a terrific spring was Chris Rogers, who didn't play much last year. He's a terrific athlete, a sideline to sideline type guy. That rotation of three is going to do the bulk of the playing time. Then a fourth guy, Mekhi Williams, the coaches like too, who had been around Tulane for a while, hadn't played much, but they're going to be more it's not, you don't just automatically replace Tyler Grubbs, but they're actually going to be a more athletic group this year than they were last year.
Moving over to the defensive backfield, it'll look a little bit different here in 2025. 4 of the top 7 guys in this room have either graduated or hit the portal, but this backfield is highlighted by the return of a trio in safeties and Bailey Despaney, Jack Chinchu, and Kevin Adams III. The staff also added 5 transfers heading into 2025. I'm curious about this cornerback room, but what should we expect from the defensive backfield here in 2025?
Quarterback is the concern on this roster, and that was another one. It was a huge concern last year too. They ended last spring with a walk-on named Rishi Ratan, who was their best cornerback. Now, Rayshon Pleasant had been injured for most of spring, but yeah, last year. That was a huge loss. Rayshon Pleasant was going to be a star this year. Yeah. He's one of the best kickoff returners in the country, so they lose that. He had 2 kickoff returns for touchdowns last year and almost a couple of more, but he was also going to be a great cornerback. When he left, all their other cornerbacks were seniors last year. They were bereft of experience, but a guy named Jaheim Johnson, who didn't really play much last year, looked pretty good in the spring. You don't know how he's going to play during games, but other than that, it was a little shaky. So I think they knew they had to get a starting cornerback, so they got LJ Green, who started every game at Troy last year and who John Summerall and his staff recruited. I'm pretty sure the 2 starters are going to be him and Jaheim Johnson. They've got another guy named Armani Cargo, who didn't play at all last year. He was first team at the end of spring. He'll be in the mix too. But yeah, it's definitely, there's no proven player that's been on the team. LJ Green had a pretty good year at Troy last year, but that to me is the position that if they're going to be in trouble, it's going to be at that spot this fall.
Was there a guy in the secondary that looks like they're maybe ready to take the next step or take their game to the next level, whether it's someone new or a returnee?
It's definitely Jack Chinchu, who did not start last year but put up starter numbers, and I was kind of surprised that he didn't start. I think he's probably going to be the best player in their secondary at safety. He's good in run support. He's a good ball hawk. He hits hard. I think he's headed for an all AAC caliber year, and I think he's going to be the star of the secondary. You saw the signs last year, and now that he had all that experience coming off the bench but playing almost starter downs last year, I think he's going to be the difference maker back in the back end. Bailey Despaney has a ton of experience. That's always good. He's not quite the playmaker that Jack Chinchu is, but that combo, I think they're in good shape at the back end of the defense.
All right, Gary, we've got a lot of transfers on the line. We've got a pretty solid linebacking group. We've got some questions in the secondary, but we like Jack Chinchu. If you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who would that be?
Yeah, I just named him. I should have waited a little bit there. Jack Chinchu. Again, he had good numbers last year, and he didn't start a single game. In the spring, he was making plays all over the field. I really do think he can be first team all conference. I think he'll have at least 5 interceptions this year. He'll be top behind the 2 line. He'll probably be he'll be in the top 3 or 4 in tackles. He's a playmaker.
Let's move over to the special teams. How did those units look this spring, and are there any concerns?
Well, they're definitely concerns now, but and you know that was the one position I'm bad with names sometimes, but yeah, they're Aussie punter, and they had about 5 guys transferred during spring practice, and John Summerall wasn't happy about that, but the one guy he was really angry about was the punter, who came in and informed him 1 week before the end of spring that he was leaving. And Summerall even openly said he thought there was tampering going on, that the kid already probably knew what school he was going to, that's not allowed. He didn't say that about any of the other players. He didn't really wish him well, particularly, and kid ended up at UCLA. And he was a Willie Fritz recruit. He had 2 solid years. He wasn't great, but he was very solid for Tulane. They addressed that need. They went and they got the punter from Marshall last year. Tulane's special teams coach was at Marshall last year. The kid transferred to Southern Miss followed his head coach, but then left at the end of spring, and is going to be Tulane's punter. His numbers he averaged about a yard less per punt than Tulane's guy did last year, but kicker is a concern too. It was a concern last year. It may look, they got their butts kicked by Army in the AAC championship game, but it didn't help that they had 2 field goals at the beginning of the game that they totally botched. Now you can say it was the operation, you could whatever, but they were pitiful efforts. They don't know, they don't know who their kicker is going to be right now. They have a local kid coming in who's a freshman who has a monster leg, but he wasn't always even accurate in high school. So that's another a pretty big concern for this team, is they had too many. I mean, there was a game against Oklahoma last year. They had a kicker kick the extra point under the upright, under the crossbar. I mean, you don't see that very often. That's something they have to get fixed, and it's not really clear right now who's going to end up being the guy there.
With you mentioned earlier losing Pleasant, the big deals on the return game. Did anyone kind of step up to seize that opportunity?
They've got no specific. They had a bunch of guys doing it again. Where they think they're going to be better is at punt returner, because they didn't do much at that position last year, and they really think Omari Hayes is going to be now. A lot of the teams that do it the right way, there aren't really many punt returns in college football anymore, because everybody's allowed to go down the field before, But if they get opportunities, they really think he's a game breaker. He's not a guy that returns kickoffs that much. There's a bunch of candidates there, but they have a good system and they block well. I mean, Rayshon Pleasant was great last year, but part of the reason he was so good was they really had a good scheme in front of them. So I think they feel pretty comfortable there. They don't have a Rayshon Pleasant, but they use about 4 or 5 different guys in the spring. I think whoever they end up using will be among the conference leaders.
Now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you think is the most concerning heading into the season?
3. I did quarterback, wide receiver, and cornerback. Those 3. I think they're, even though there's an amazing turn. I mean, Tulane only has 5 returning starters total, counting offense, defense, and kickers, but they look good at most positions, but those are kind of important positions. Again, they're actually ahead of where they were last year at quarterback, but you just can't assume somebody's going to develop like Darian Mensah did last year. So in general, I think they can. Cornerback is a concern on defense, but they've got enough on defense that they can maybe hide. If they get the pressure that they got in the spring, you can hide your cornerbacks a little bit. You can't hide when you don't have quarterbacks and wide receivers, and that's going to be the key to determine whether this team, which overall I think is as talented as any team in the league, that's going to be the key of whether they can actually get back to another conference championship game.
Well, I can tell you, I live in Iowa, so I think you can hide a wide receiver pretty well. And you got a quarterback who knows just how well Iowa hides their wide receivers.
Yeah. Iowa improved exponentially on offense last year, and they were still one of the 20 worst offenses in the country. So that's usually not a good look. Yeah.
In today's age of NIL, revenue sharing, and the transfer portal, how have you seen that change Tulane's recruiting philosophy?
John Summerall is the perfect coach for that environment, because it's got to be tough on any coach if a guy losing a guy like Rayshon Pleasant, which obviously never would have happened in the past. That's a tough blow. But John Summerall, he's young. He understands how it works. Tulane actually has a salary cap guy, basically, that they hired during the year to advise them on all of these issues, and they've done a tremendous job. I mean, again, I saw a listing the other day that rated teams in the transfer portal, and I believe Tulane was in the top 3 again of the group of 5 schools, along with Memphis and one other one. And again, USA Today did one of those ridiculous early rankings of every team in the country, 1 through whatever 127, and they had Tulane 39, which was the highest of any AAC team. And again, that's a team that doesn't know who their quarterback is going to be, only returns five starters. That tells you about the respect that John Summerall has in terms of a talent accumulator.
Well, how do you feel like the staff at Tulane has been doing navigating the portal?
Great. Again, they've just done it well. They identify needs. Like last year, I think 5 of their starters came after the end of spring, because Summerall realized at the end of spring that he told Joe Craddock, you're going to have to score 40. If we don't get new guys, you're going to have to score 40 points a game for us to have a good season, was his direct quote once the season started. And they went and they got Sam Howard. They got 2 of their top 3 cornerbacks. They just loaded up on the transfer portal. They got Aiden Huntington. I mean, they had a ton of new starters. John Summerall is really good in his staff at identifying after spring what their needs are, and then going out and getting a difference maker at those positions. And that in this modern age of college football, you got to do that, because you're going to lose players. That's just the way it works.
Well, Gary, you got me excited to see more of these the defensive line and all those guys that they keep in. Like, I was excited. I'm more excited.
Yeah, and that was one, because the coaches, like the first day of practice, John Summerall talked about, and I was like, nobody hits anymore, and especially in the first week of spring practice. How could you even know? But then when they started hitting and started doing stuff, even the untrained eye could tell how good these guys looked. Again, you have to balance it with a young offensive line and stuff like that. But these coaches, I mean, I don't think he did an interview where John Summerall didn't eventually turn it around to talking about at least one defensive lineman and how excited he is about that group.
Well, I think that's a great segue to what the answer is to our next question. Yeah. What do you think the main strength of this 2025 team will be?
Yeah, if Santana Hopper is half as good as his teammates say he is, then Tulane's going to have a big year up front. I didn't even mention. I mean, they had so many transfer guys. Trevor McAlpine from Texas Tech. Just one guy after Trevon McAlpine. One guy after the other that flashed during, and it's 2 deep. They'll be able to, maybe even 3 deep. They'll be able to rotate guys in and out. Gerard Henderson's another guy I didn't mention. He was a guy last year who improved more than any player on the roster from the beginning of fall to the end of the year. He's going to be in the rotation. They're excited. The only caveat is they haven't played together in an actual game, so we got to see how they mesh. But if they play like they did in those last 2 scrimmages, it's going to be pretty fun to watch for Tulane fans.
What does success look like for the Green Wave in 2025?
It's crazy to say, given the history of this program until a few years ago, but they want to make the conference championship game again. Tulane's done it 3 years in a row. John Summerall's done it in all 3 years as a coach, 2 years at Troy and then at Tulane. It's funny. A former assistant under Willie Fritz, Cody Kennedy, who I think now is at Arkansas. He was an offensive line coach in 2019 and 2020. They rehired Will Hall, who was their offensive coordinator under Willie Fritz, to help out with the offense this year. Cody Kennedy stopped by in spring the first week to say hi to Will Hall, and he came up to me and said that he would have killed. The coaches would have killed to have the overall talent that they have now back in 2019 in that period when they were going like 7-5 and stuff like that. He compared Tulane. He was saying Tulane is like, in terms of talent and who they brought in, like UCF was several years ago, and like Houston was, and Memphis now. That might be a little overboard, but that's how. And that was just from him observing one practice one day, just talking about the difference in the actual athletic ability than from what it was during most of Willie Fritz's tenure. So the raw ability is there, but it's asking a lot when you're breaking in a new quarterback and all new wide receivers and even all new running backs. To do that, but I think they've got a fighting chance.
Well, Gary, we've covered a lot of ground today, but is there anything else you want to share or think that we should know about this 2025 Tulane Green Wave football team?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. I think if they can find a kicker that's reliable, and they can find at Troy, they had a game manager coordinator. They're not going to have a quarterback as good as Darian Mintz. I'm pretty sure I can say that right now. But John Summerall won 2 championships at Troy with a quarterback who is primarily a game manager, and I think that's more what they're going to be looking for this year. If they can find a quarterback that doesn't hurt them and makes the plays that are there, I think the talent around them is enough that they'll make a really another run at a conference championship. But we'll have to wait and see on that.
Well, Gary, thank you for taking time out of your day to spend with us and sharing your knowledge. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. You guys do tremendous research, and you made my job easier tonight.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.